If they're starting housing development in California, that's exactly what they do. And by doing those things, they get the wrong answer, at least 95% of the time. Zoning rules is not what governs the answer to this question in California, because when we did it that way, we didn't build any housing. Welcome back to the Infill Insiders. I'm Sibley Simon from Workbench, and I'm really excited that we're kicking off 3 episodes where we're really going to talk through all the nuances of how you calculate permitted density of housing for a given parcel, for a given site in California. This is often misunderstood, or there's a lot of gaps in knowledge out there. I meet folks all the time in the housing industry who don't know all of this. And so I'm hoping that these episodes in particular will really be impactful, because this is applicable to almost every housing development project. And in many cases, more housing could be created and work well on a site, but for a lack of this knowledge. So really excited to get this all out here. And today with us for part 1 is Chris Hudon, who's Director of Development at Workbench. And I wanted Chris here for this first version of how we calculate. We're going to do 3 different versions, and often more than one of these could be applicable to a given site. So you have to look at it different ways sometimes. But this first version, I wanted to have you here because you're an experienced developer, but not in California. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've done?
So my background has been, for the last 25 years, really focused in the state of Colorado and Utah in multifamily development. And never have used state laws. I've always used the local jurisdictions, gone through general plans and zoning and a lot of relationship type of development.
What we're covering today is how you figure out what density of housing you can get permitted, that really, if you're doing it right, a local jurisdiction in California is required to approve without, zoning change, general plan amendment, all that kind of stuff that would be totally discretionary. So staying within the box of what state law says needs to be approved. How do you calculate that when the basis for the calculation is in local code in terms of units per acre or square feet per unit or something, but basically the area of land per a certain number of units. Okay. So that's what we're going to look at today. In Colorado, where you've worked before, if people wanted to figure this out, how much density under the laws, code, et cetera, that applies, how much density could I permit? What would you do to figure it out in a nutshell?
Right. You look at the constraints of the site itself. You look at the land area. You look at the height limits, you look at the density allowed in that zone district, and then you look for what the setbacks are, and you basically squeeze into the piece of land that you can actually build on.
So basically zoning and site constraints is what you would look at. Yep. And if you didn't understand the zoning, or if there's something unclear about how to apply it.
And typically what I would do is get a high-level concept together and get an informal meeting with the planning department, float that by them, see if get a temperature taken on the idea, and then go back and start to dig into it.
So that's great summary. And in my experience, talking to folks out there, if they're starting housing development in California, that's exactly what they do. And by doing those things, looking up the zoning, doing an initial consult with the local staff at local government, they get the wrong answer, at least 95% of the time. And there's not a diss on local staff who know the local rules, but that is all looking under the local rules. And that in general, that zoning rules is not what governs the answer to this question in California, it turns out. Because we're weird, because when we did it that way, we didn't build any housing. So all those rules are still in place, but we've added new rules that change the game. So what do you do here? So what you do, and I literally have just had multiple conversations with development projects that we're not involved in the last week explaining this. The first thing you do is you look at the general plan. So in California, we have a general plan, which has the environmental analysis for a planning document for a whole jurisdiction. And then once that's approved, then we write more specific zoning rules. So in general, every place that you could develop in California, if residential use is allowed, that parcel by parcel will have a general plan designation. That's a broad category. So an example might be a single family home. It might be called something like residential low density. And the general plan might describe that as I'm thinking of, one of our projects that's entitled in the city of Santa Cruz with Peace United Church, for example. They had the 6-acre parcel. We were going to build on 2.3 acres or so of it. And that general plan designation said 1 to 10 units per acre.
Okay.
And the idea was it was a single family home. So you have a single family home and you could have a parcel and you could have up to 10 parcels per acre. But if you only have one parcel, you put one house, right? But then that was a general plan designation, but then it doesn't really say much else in the general plan. And then then there's zones. And even within that general plan designation of, let's say, low density residential, if that's what it was called, then there might be R15 or R110 where they say, okay, it's one house, residential, there's one house per lot. And of course you could do an ADU or something, but one main house per lot. And then you could do 5 of those per acre or 10 of those per acre in that zone. So there might be a general plan map. There should be a general plan map in the general plan that has the whole city or county laid out by areas, these designations, low density residential, high density residential, commercial mixed use, whatever. But then in the zoning code, there might be more maps that are more detailed with more different zones, right? It's kind of a tree diagram. So it turns out state law, we're talking about, units per acre density, but that's a fraction, right? Units per acre. And so we have to figure out how many units per acre do we get? And then we got to figure out what our acreage is, right? So under how many units per acre we get, what state law says in California is that if that number's not the same in zoning or the general plan, you get to take the larger number.
Okay.
But because of how environmental analysis works in this planning process, it's if one of them is bigger, it's almost always the general plan, 99% or whatever. And then zoning's more restrictive. You could have, and so you have to check, we have one site we're helping an owner with where, as I think you've heard, there's the general plan and there's the zoning, and then there's 3 overlay districts, and one of those overlay districts borrows or refers to conditions from another zone. And so to do your homework, you check all of those and go with the largest number. But almost always it's the general plan. So the quick thing is just look up the general plan. Now, my whole spiel here about how we calculate density is presuming that one would use density bonus law, which means you have to have a base density of 5 units. So you got to start with a site where you could, under this general plan density, where you could do at least 5 units. If your site's so small for that density, you can't even do 5 units, then you do have to use zoning.
Okay. But could you rezone into something?
You can always rezone.
The density bonus.
Yeah, right. You'd have to either rezone or make a general plan amendment. If the general plan amendment is a bigger deal, the EIR, because environmental analysis didn't necessarily contemplate more density there,
go through all those hoops,
and it's entirely discretionary.
Get to the
entirely. Okay. So you could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on that, and everybody seems to like it. And at the last second, the city council could say, no, not going to do that. It's totally within their right, to do it. Okay. So I would generally tell people, don't do a general plan amendment or, unless you're some really big thing and long-term and you've got 10 years and it's going to be world change and the community generally likes it. So just don't do it. So density bonus law is critical for multifamily development in California. Even if you're not going to use extra density, which we're going to assume today and talk about, but even if you're not, it brings with it the waivers and concessions and process things, and just it's so critical for getting multifamily housing development approved and in a way that's feasible. So we presuppose we're going to work on that. So if you don't use density bonus law and say you don't do any affordable housing in your project, then you do have to follow zoning. Okay, so that's where I got off on this other track. So to use density bonus law, where you get to do more housing, what we're talking about is figuring out our base density. So that's where we look at that general plan and we get to use the largest number in the zoning or the general plan or some overlay district. But usually there's the general plan. So in the example I was described, the general plan designation places in that would go up to allowing 10 units per acre. So that's what we got to use.
Okay.
10 units per acre as our base density.
Okay.
And the other thing is you get to round up your base density. So if and I think that was applicable in this case. I'm going to make up the exact number, but let's say there was 2.23 acres in our lot, okay? And 10 units per acre would give you 2.23 acres times 10, right? So 22.3 homes. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And with many things, you just say, oh, 22, well, I can't build 0.3 of a house, so I build, 22 houses or 22 apartments, whatever. But explicitly in California state law is when you're calculating base density for density bonus law, you get to round up, no matter what the fraction is. If it's 22.0001 homes allowed, then I get to build 23 as my base density.
You can't round up the acreage?
No, you don't round up the acreage.
Just joking. That was a good one.
Right. Now you take the actual acreage. Now, a lot of times it is important. Your county GIS or something, that acreage that's in there might not be quite right. That's, it could be approximate. So sometimes it can matter to get an exact survey of the property in this case. And you can imagine if it does tip you into another unit, and then that percolates through density bonus law, you might get multiple extra units in theory from 1 square foot if it tipped you over in the calculation, right? But also you don't want to go down the road of designing and then do a Alta survey and find out, oh, I got 300 square feet fewer than I thought, and that actually reduces my number. So it's good to know really for sure how many square feet do you have. So that's that, denominator of the units per acre. The other thing on that is, I'm glad you brought that up, is that if you look in local codes, they will often say, well, our density in our general plan or in our zoning, that's a density of units per acre, but that's net buildable acre. Or slope over 30% area doesn't count towards that. Or the public right-of-way area. But state law is clear in California. For this calculation, you use the entire gross area of
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
To your point about site constraints, you might have a steep area and a not steep area. You're going to build down here, but you can still use the density for the entire area if it makes sense and fits what you want to do. If you have that extra steep area, that does give you more acreage if it's planned that way to provide more houses. So we got gross area. We've found our maximum locally allowed under the general plan number of units per acre. And that kind of makes sense because the general plan, again, it had the environmental studies. So in theory, that area was allowed. And then for some reason, they just restricted it further with zoning. So it's like, okay, you can't bump up past that. What was environmentally studied in terms of that as base density?
Okay.
Then we get to density bonus law. And this has been there's been a density bonus law in California for a long, long time, but it was rarely used for a long time.
And it's used to capture more units for allowing affordable housing?
That's right. So I think a lot of the law has been done also because so little housing was getting created. Mm-hmm. And more certainty was put into the law with more streamlined process, all this stuff. But also, we really need housing. So more housing often is a good thing in and of itself. But yes, the mechanics and trade-off of it is you figure out your base density. And then if you want to build more housing in that, you have a certain percentage of that number of units that is affordable at a certain income level, and you have choices. And we're not going to go way into that today. We'll do another podcast on exactly how to use and qualify for density bonus law and what else it gets you besides density. Today, we're just focused on the density.
Okay.
But yes, to get more density through it, you take some of those, we're saying 23 units of base density, and we might at a very minimum have 5% of those as very low income units, right? Or some larger percentage, 10% of them as low income units or whatever. So different income levels, different percentage. And the more of the bigger percentage you do at a certain income level, the more bonus density you get.
Okay.
And there's tables you look up on that. And with small projects, the rounding can get weird. Sometimes you do more affordable housing, you don't get more units or whatever. But and again, we'll get into a lot of developers do use very low income rather than low income, different things. But the point is you do some affordable housing. But what we're here today to talk about is how much housing can you do total, regardless of what, because you might get funding that restricts the rent or you might do different things, right? But how much housing total? Okay, so we've got our base density. We've calculated it from our area. We have this example with 23 units of base density. So now the traditional density bonus in California is up to 50. When I started, it was up to 35%. And then they expanded to go up to 50%. So if you do enough affordable housing within your base density, you get 50% more units.
Okay.
So with 23 base density units, I like this example because it's at every step in this calculation you actually get around. Oh, 23 base density units, half of 23 is 11 and a half.
You get 12.
So you get 12 more units with this first base density. Okay. So we got 23 units plus 12. We're at 35 units. If I did this right? Okay. Yep. 35 units now. So we've done some, let's say, very low income affordable units within the 23 as a percentage just of the 23. And now we get 12 more units. And so the idea is that those potentially market rate units pay for taking a loss, the project taking a financial loss on some affordable housing. Great. And more housing is getting created. I really believe in most cases, is the right thing. So 35 units. Okay. Then a few years ago, the state legislature passed a second density bonus, and it has fewer options in it than the first one. It only has 2 income levels you're allowed to do to qualify for it: very low income or moderate income. And again, we'll get later into how you look at all these income levels. But the point is, moderate income, if you give moderate income housing, was one of their big motivations in this. So folks around the median income level don't qualify for lower income affordable housing. So they would say, how do we get some of that out there? Well, let's do a second density bonus. Oh. Now, if you also put some moderate income housing in, certain percentage of your base density still, not of the 35, but of the 23. But again, we're not worried about that too much today. Okay. But you still look back at your base density. Also within it, you've already done some of your base density units, say, is very low income affordable housing. Now you're going to do some of those 23 units, a percentage of them as moderate income housing. Okay. So now we got 2 tranches of affordable housing and some market rate housing in that base density of 23 units, then an additional 12 potentially market rate units. Now you get another 50%. If you've done enough moderate income housing. Again, it ratchets up based on how much you've done, but let's say you max it out. How much? Now that is 50% of the base density.
So another 12.
Another 12. You're right. Because independent of the first one, you calculate it and round up.
Okay.
So it's not, some people, understandably, because there's 2 50% bonuses that are each, they're not compounding, they're each of the original base density. So a lot of people go out and say there's a 100% bonus. But if your base density is odd, it's a bit more than 100%, right? So you get 2 12-unit bonuses here. So we went from 23 to 35, now we're at 47.
It's a very different project than what you would start with, right?
Right.
Normally.
Potentially, if you use all this.
Yeah.
Yes. So that is how we do it. 2 tranches of affordable housing, 2 density bonuses. And then again, this is assuming it makes sense on your site. One of the top reasons people might not use this is, building height. If you have more than 5 stories, you're not wood frame. You're either mass timber or concrete and steel, right? And that's more expensive. And so they might say, well, that's not worth it to do more units, even if they're market rate units,
Right.
If the whole building has to change to a different construction type or, other things. Or it'd be like, look, we really want to do for sale townhouses, and to fit more in, you'd have to do stacked flats or apartments, right? And that's not what our project is. And this is how many townhouses fit in, right? So there's a lot of reasons, different reasons you might not use all the density, but this shows you what's allowable that you could do. However,
can I ask a question
please.
on that? You don't have to use the maximum density.
That's right.
You can dial that back a little bit.
And in fact, density bonus law gives many other benefits besides extra units, besides the density bonus. And so the density bonus law explicitly says, black and white right there, that you qualify for any of those benefits, even if you're not building the bonus units. You don't have to do any extra units. And because you've done the affordable housing, you get waivers and concessions, which are extremely useful. And we'll get to a whole podcast about that.
And those are separate from the
extra unit.
If you reduce density, you still get to use the waivers and concessions.
Yeah, that's right. And your first 23 units in the example I gave are all base density units. You don't get to say, well, I'm only going to do 10 density bonus, 10 base density units. I'm only going to use part of the base density and then do bonus units. You can't do that. Until you've used the base density of your whole parcel, they're all base density units, and your affordable housing, which could be an inclusionary ordinance or this density bonus law is keyed off of that, however many base density units you're building in your project.
Okay.
So if we only wanted a 20 unit project, in my example, they'd all be base density units. You do a percentage of those, perhaps is affordable. But yeah, you get to use as much of the benefit as you want to. However, we're not done.
There's more?
There's more. But wait, one more thing. You know what ADUs are, accessory dwelling units.
Yes.
Right? And famously, they're backyard units. And they are the number one most successful thing that the state legislature has done to increase housing supply in the last decade. Because there's 20,000 units or so of ADUs being created every year in California now. And mostly is backyard units. Yeah. And that was like, probably under 50 before the state law. Because there were a few places like Santa Cruz that allowed ADUs in very specific circumstances through a tortured process. And so we'd get maybe 10 or 15 a year here in Santa Cruz. Been there a couple other places, but that was it. And now everywhere it's allowed ADUs, blah, 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 blah. So lots of those, a huge success. And it's a success partly because the state legislature did a good job. Okay, let's allow it. Oh, let's see what's not working. Let's fiddle with that. Now let's allow more of this and keep working. Okay. On that process, the state legislature said, this is working so well. Let's allow ADUs in certain ways in multifamily buildings. That the two most, intentional ways that was being used is say, well, let's say you have an apartment building already. And in the law it says an existing apartment building, and you've got space in that building you're not using. Maybe people use less
inside the building.
Okay. Some part of the building that's underused. Well, you can convert some of that space into units. You could build out a unit, and let's say there's a storage space in the building.
Conference room that no one uses.
You could build that out, within building code and meeting all the requirements, everything else, right? You could build that out into a unit, and that is an ADU within your existing apartment building or condo building or something. Okay, so that's one way. Another way is you could have an apartment building on a lot, and there's open space on the lot you're not using, and you could build a couple ADUs on the lot, separate building that are detached from your apartment building, from your multifamily building. They could be attached to each other, but a couple of those. So we'll get to a couple of details. However, what this means is there's many circumstances in which you can design a building with extra space in it. Especially because density bonus law in many cases allows you to build taller, allows you to build, lesser setbacks or other things, right? If you need that. And so you can design and build a multifamily apartment building with space in the building that's not housing and not critical. It's not your electrical room or your trash room or whatever. And some extra amenity space, undefined, or storage space or whatever. And then you can convert that into more units. So you could plan to do that from the beginning.
So those would give you more units than your maximum density.
Exactly, because those are an addition.
Because I was going to ask, why wouldn't you just put units in those spaces to begin with?
Because we've maxed out. Because sometimes there's definitely places where it's a great place for a multifamily building, but the local density is pretty low. Right. And if you're going to go through all this to build a building and construction costs are extremely high, you really need to make, how hard it is to get things to pencil out here. Right. So yes, you get a double effectively, or maybe round up a bit, whatever, but approximately double your number of units. So under this multifamily ADU law in California, you can do up to another 25 of your total units in your building. So now, we'll just keep on with now we're in, fictitious world potentially, but 47, we had that 47 unit project. We were just talking about 23 units plus 12, we got to 47 units. Now we can take that total number of approved units, if it's 47, and you can do up to 25% of that as additional ADUs within that building.
Is that 9 units?
Now that you do not get a round up.
Can't round up to that
because that's not a density bonus calculation. Okay. This is a separate law and you can't go 1 inch above 25%. So with 47, right, a quarter of 44 would be 11, and we don't go to 48 to get another one. So that you would need to round down, even though we're pretty close to getting to 12. In this case, we got to round all the way down to 11. So you could do up to 11. ADUs in a building like that. And separately from within the building, you can, on any multifamily parcel with existing housing, you can do up to 2 lot-based ADUs. Doesn't count toward that 25%, but has to be detached in a separate building.
Wow.
And
so you're up to
47
you're up to
plus
47
11.
plus 11. So you're up to 58
plus 2.
Plus you could possibly
if you have the
two,
space. If you're not just, building out a whole like super infill lot. If you have space, you could build 2 more. Yeah.
3 to 60.
To 60. That's true. There's a little bit of nuance. Now, when I'm saying this about all of this, about density bonus law, about these bonuses and the ADU law, all of these things are in state law actually as the minimum that a local jurisdiction must allow. So it is rare, but there are cases where jurisdictions have implemented a more generous density bonus, or I say more generous, but it might be do even more affordable housing and get an even bigger bonus kind of thing.
Okay. Right. Project by project?
No, in their code.
In their code.
Yeah, we're all trying to go for not discretionary here. Okay. Just what do I know, without any politics, that in theory, legally, the jurisdiction has to provide. If all this checks out environmentally and everything else you have to do, you get a fire truck and get around the building and all this stuff, right? Yeah. But, without the site constraint version, what could you know that you're going to get approval of? And so they can. So, for example, in the city of Santa Cruz, they specifically allow you to round up that ADU within the building. It's just what they put in their ordinance. And the state allows that. In these types of rules, state law is a minimum. Okay. And I know there's jurisdictions, and I think San Diego city or county has allowed more lot-based ADUs. There's different things like that in different places. I don't have it all in my head, but lot-based ADUs is another one where sometimes jurisdictions have been more generous. Usually not. Usually they copy what's in the state law as the minimum required, paste it in the local code, go approve it, and then city council and supervisors get a say, we're solving the housing crisis. Look at how much we just improved the local code. Or they say, darn that state legislature, they're making us do this and we hate it. One of those two things, if not both. So it is always worth looking and saying, is there a little, you look up the local version of the density bonus calculation and there might be a bigger bonus for even more affordable housing you might want to consider. Or the round up on the number of ADUs, kind of thing. The one hitch on these ADUs that is still being looked at, worked out, decided, is that it does say in the state law, in the minimum ordinance required by the state, that applies to quote unquote existing buildings, which means in theory, you might have to build the building first, build that space in it, and then get a building permit to convert those. And that's a ministerial building permit. Okay. Nothing's stopping you. It's not another hearing or anything, but that's a longer construction process, right? If you can't start some of your interior work or something like that to build that into a unit, if you have to make it empty rooms with pipes like and electrical outlets and then
retail space into a mixed use
and then building it out.
Exactly.
So there's no question state law. Okay, you're allowed to do that for sure. We keep pushing, being like that waiting is helping nobody. Everybody agrees we could do that, but we're just going to have longer, more expensive construction. It just causes housing to be more expensive, right? For example, the city of Santa Cruz passed an ordinance that said, you can include those conversion ADUs in your building permit for the whole building. So they agreed in their own local ordinance to move that step up. Okay. So you could, just go build it all at the same time. We're looking to use a concession for that in another project in another jurisdiction so we say, okay, you just have the state code copied and pasted and it says existing housing, we can do this. So we all know we could build it. How about you use a density bonus concession to allow us to apply earlier for these and build it at the same time instead of building one and then the other. So there's some nuances there, but everybody agrees, you're allowed to build the space and then build those units. So that is how something that might be zoned for, make this up, but it may well be true that like this, on this example project I'm talking about, might be zoned for 5 units an acre. But because we had to use the general plan and round it up, and then the bonus, and then the ADUs, like you said, in theory, one could get to 60 units, whereas the zoning might have been, 5 units per acre, so 12-unit project or something like that. You might say, I saw you reacting a little bit, you might say it was like, whoa, we got to such a big number. Well, just to feel more philosophically, high level, part of the reason that this happened, it's not just like, oh, how do we pay for some affordable housing? That's part of it. But all the land use incentives in California were to downzone, downzone, downzone. So, just as one example, I know like Los Angeles, obviously biggest city in California, in the 1960s, it was zoned for millions more units of housing than it is now. Just
Right.
every decade we kept downzoning. And so when we talk about the zone capacity, if every parcel was built to its zone capacity, we actually wouldn't have that much more housing. We got to that point, right? And so that's part of the state legislature looking and saying, well, people, there's a lot of folks in local government or just local folks seeing all this change happen and saying, oh, the state legislature is taking all this power away. But actually, I would say local government still has 90% of the power, but that's to plan up front. And then once you plan for it, and now, yes, you have to plan and have these bonuses and get some affordable housing out of that and that kind of stuff. But once you plan in that way and then look how these laws could be used, then you can't say no to projects that follow all these rules, right?
Right.
It is awkward, though, that the planning happened and then these bonuses got added up on top, but that's because the plans always kept downzoning. And so it was just literally not legal to build the housing we need.
It reminds me of transit-oriented development. And so those zone districts, those overlays all changed based on the nodes of the transit options, right? So it's
Exactly.
similar.
Exactly, and that's going to be mentioned in our third episode. So here in the broader context now, okay, we've just explained exactly how you do it when you find your units per acre allowed, and to sometimes those units per acre, they can be sometimes expressed the opposite way, which is like how many square feet of ground do you need for each unit? But it's the same thing. You do it that way. And we have actually seen like, well, you need this many square feet of ground for a studio and this much square feet of ground on your parcel for a 2-bedroom. So you get a little but you figure that out and then you do this calculation and then these state laws allow more housing and that's that. It just turns out that in a lot of most places that allow housing, that's how you'd calculate it. So it is in that it's really a minimum lot size. Might be another way the same thing's expressed. It might be, a single family and a minimum lot size is X. Well, that really just tells you how many units per acre. And by the way, when you do this calculation, you no longer have to have them be single family. Like you can do it because the density bonus law also allows you to then do it as an apartment building or condos or whatever. While that's most common by area, the reality is mostly where we're doing apartment buildings is on bigger corridor streets or downtowns. And it's relatively common now in those areas that the general plan limit on density is not expressed in units per acre. Sometimes it is, but often, increasingly in more and more places, it's form-based density. And so it just says an FAR, a height limit, a setback limit. And so that is an advertisement for next episode, where if there is no units per acre limit, then you have to do a totally different calculation with a different process. And then episode 3 in this series, the third episode in the series is going to be, either you do what we just did, units per acre, calculation, great, or you do form-based density, which is our second episode, you do that. One of those two things applies. That's great. However, there are also other state laws that say, but if you're near transit, or if you're in this kind of parcel, or that kind of parcel, or this situation, or that situation, and that calculation doesn't come out dense enough, then forget all that. Start over with this base density.
Wow.
And so
That's a lot to learn.
And so episode 3 is really important. Even if you have units per acre, you're not done yet when you do what we just did. You need to go check a bunch of other things to see if a different density actually applies.
Wow.
So I had to leave you with that.
I'm excited for the next 2 episodes.
So, all right, great. When we're talking in this podcast about an actual housing bill that passes in California, then I like to rate it as like, how big of a problem is this solving? Like a 1, super big problem, 5, kind of symbolic. I actually think we're not doing that here because we're not assessing one bill, but I do think, and then I like to grade it and how effectively is it doing that. This is a great example, though, even though it's not a bill, where I think this is a 1. As we were just talking about, we lost all our zone capacity. So there's no way to build housing. And on most sites, you couldn't build enough on that one site to make it work financially, right? So it was a huge problem. The number one way that housing that we needed was not legal to build. Huge problem. Great. Well, if you were to give what you've heard so far, in California, how are we doing? How does this whole scheme, how well does it solve that problem? A letter grade. There's no wrong answer. What would you say?
Well, I think the idea it absolutely it would be an A, because we're pushing forward and we're laying out the groundwork to actually build this housing.
Great. That is, I think, one totally justifiable answer. I am going to give it a C, maybe even a C minus, because you're right. In terms of, does it legalize the housing we need and solve it? Yes. Is this so complicated that hardly anyone knows it? And even that's why I say, even with great respect, don't go talk to local jurisdiction staff first, because they also don't know all of these things in all three of these podcasts and won't give you the right answer. And so if hardly anyone understands it and therefore is actually doing it, did it actually solve the problem, like the tree falling in the forest that didn't make a sound? Incorrect metaphor. But at the end of the day, it only solves the problem if the housing actually gets built. And that's what I'm saying. Yes, it does legally zone the capacity we need. The housing we need is now legal in California to build. Awesome. Is it going to happen because of this? It's so messy and complicated. That's where I'm going to C minus.
The execution of it.
Yeah. So there you go. So we'll leave it at that. We'll come back next time with form-based density, also extremely relevant to a lot of places folks would build multifamily, but also just want to put out there, relevant to our current discussion. There's always more nuance. Court cases are changing these things. So if you ever want help, we're here for that at Workbench. Give us a call. Literally talk to folks about this all the time. And we'd love to even get involved and help you entitle more density in a great housing project.